Welcome, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, the Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Why Rain Gardens Fail and Tools for Success. This is part of the Focus on Sustainability webinar series developed by a group of organizations across the country known for their quality ecological education. By collaborating on the webinars, we expand the reach of our programs to a broader audience. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they're largely nonprofit and volunteer groups in the United States. The regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, Deep Roots Kansas City, Rescape California, and the American Public Gardens Association. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Stephen Torgerson, who is a registered landscape architect and the Director of Landscape Architecture at AMT Landscape Architecture and Design Division. He has nationwide experience in planning and design within an ecologically resilient framework and is passionate about creating spaces that are a catalyst for people to interact with their environment and community. Mr. Torgerson's multidisciplinary design approach encourages alternative solutions to complex rainwater problems. Today, he'll share his solutions for successful rain gardens. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, and welcome everybody today. And with that, I will go ahead and jump into my presentation. So I'm setting up the problem, and truly this is the situation in which we all deal with. Rain comes down out of the sky, and at times maybe it doesn't come down as much as we want, and other times it comes down more than we want. However, when before we built cities, the rain would come out of the sky and it would hit the leaves, it would hit the trees, it would hit the ground, and 10% of it would run off, 40% of it would evaporate. And then we had 25% with the shallow infiltration and 25% with the deep infiltration. With the construction of cities and towns and houses in which we all live and enjoy, this process has changed, where now we have 30% evapotranspiration, 55% runoff, 10% shallow infiltration, and only 5% deep infiltration. So this is a big change from 55% runoff to 10% runoff. So what we try to do with rain gardens is to create a situation in which we are mimicking nature. This is a project that I recently worked on, and I thought that it was a great photo of really how a wetland will be able to take that runoff and capture it and store it, and also help to infiltrate it into the ground over a longer period of time. We are able to mimic nature by creating meadows. And meadows are actually pretty great at slowing down that water and allowing it to infiltrate into the ground so that we get more water through into the ground. Mimicking woods in good condition. Now here where I spend a lot of my time, the rules and the laws actually state that we're trying to create a runoff situation that is similar to woods in good condition. Creating a riparian zone. Riparian zones are really great natural environments to mimic because the water is filling up, it's able to spill into the banks and to be able to store there over a period of time. So these are really what we're trying to do. Capture the water, store it on site, and then infiltrate it over time. And specifically with rain gardens, this is really important for that first flush of water as it comes off of the ground, because that first flush of water is often the most dirty. It is picking up the pollutants off of our sidewalks, our roadways, our parking lots. It is picking up the pollutants that, such as trash and sediment, and allowing it to be stored or captured. So this is an anatomy of a rain garden. And the depression of the rain garden is really important. It's often anywhere from 3 to 8 inches. When I design rain gardens, I don't like going much deeper than that for fear that the water won't infiltrate. Then typically we have an amended soil. Hopefully we can put in a green mulch, and I will define what green mulch is, but basically it's plants, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation. We have plantings, and plants that have drier feet or are okay with a drier soil. And then we need plants that can live with wet feet, but then they also need to be able to live with the dry feet, because our rain gardens don't always have water in them. And to be honest, we don't want them to always have water in them. And then infiltration. Now, interestingly enough, with a rain garden, I like using amended soils as my infiltration bed. And this becomes really important because A, it's more cost effective to amend the soils on site. And it is also a great tool to be able to just work through the process of allowing nature to happen on site without bringing on weeds and other invasive species that might come in with soil that you brought in. So here's a rain garden that we constructed a number of years ago. And this was part of the Rainscapes program for Montgomery County, Maryland. And you can see here that we've created a flat bottom area. You can see it here with my pointer. And then a berm. And then if you see in the next image here in the middle, we've accentuated that berm to be able to hold the water. Right here, this is where the water is coming in through a downspout off of the roof. And this here is a filter strip as part of that rain garden. And then finally, the plantings. So I also wanted to talk about the anatomy of a bioretention or bioswale. And this is a little bit different because it's usually something that's regulated, whereas rain gardens don't typically tend to be regulated. Now that can change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and some places do regulate rain gardens, but not in the same way. So typically we have a depression that is 6 to 12 inches. We have a filter media or a soil that is specifically designed to be able to capture pollutants. And that is anywhere from 12 to 36 inches deep. We have mulch on top, and the mulch is typically required by the code and the way that it is written. However, I also want to bring up that on top of that mulch, we have the opportunity to plant plants that can act as green mulch. Again, we have the different plants that have dry feet and plants that have wet feet. There's often a choker layer, and that choker layer is what separates the planting media from the actual sand that's below and or the stone, and then the stone below it, and then infiltration. And sometimes there's actually an underdrain. Here in Maryland and in Virginia and even up in Pennsylvania, where I spend a lot of my time doing practice, a lot of agencies, counties, townships, cities, and the state actually require that there be some type of an underdrain if we can't get the infiltration that we want. The infiltration is extremely important so that we can be successful in creating a rain garden or a bioretention or bioswale so that the water does not pond for long periods of time. So this is a checklist and a specification from one of the areas that I often spend a lot of time on. And they have broken down exactly what's required for a bioretention. So here's the media, and this is how they've broken it down. Now, interestingly enough, this changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions just say a third compost, a third sand, and a third topsoil. Other jurisdictions have it like this one, where it is a lot more sand, and I believe that this is from the District of Columbia. There's a non-woven geotextile fabric, and that is only installed on the sides in almost every jurisdiction that I work in, because we do not want to clog the bottom of it that will allow infiltration into the ground. There are a few that used to require it on the bottom, and some jurisdictions require it for other types of BMPs. There's the choker layer, and this is typically a small washed gravel that keeps the soil from filtering down into the underdrain jack storage area. And this is typically a larger washed stone. And this, I'm calling it out as V.57 stone, but there are lots of different names for it. But on the East Coast, it tends to be number 57 stone. Some places call it clean washed 3/4 minus. So here are some graphics that we developed for a project to show the different types of bioretention facilities. And as you can see, there is water that is running off of the pavement into a curb cut here, and then water here running off the sidewalk into several curb cuts that allow the water to drain into the bioretention facility. We have check dams in situations where the road is not very flat, because the bottom of this facility needs to be flat so that the water can be captured and infiltrate. This is what we call an online facility. So basically the water is running down the roadway, it hits here, it goes through the facility, and then it continues to run off. And these facilities are really important to design so that the drainage area going to it is not so great that it will blow the facility out. And then we have over here an offline facility, and in many cases very similar. However, what's happening is when this water fills up this microbioretention facility here, it spills onto the gutter, and then it continues running down the street. This system is more resilient because only so much water can get into it. Here's another example of how that system works going down the gutter. And you can see the water running down the gutter. It goes into the stormwater facility or the bioretention here. There's pre-treatment. And then when this overflows, it fills and goes back onto the gutter, or it cannot go in, and then it goes into an inlet. So that is the process that is used. I want to point out these score marks that are shown here. When you're designing a facility similar to this, it is incredibly important to design a situation in which the water can easily get into the facility. Is what happens over time is that as sediment is picked up, these areas are easily dammed up over time by that sediment. And so This process helps to create a self-cleaning system. Now, does that mean that it never has to be cleaned? No. There's always situations where it might need to be cleaned. Nevertheless, it's a much better situation than not creating that flume that can force the water into the facility. So I'm going to show a few images of a project that we worked on about a couple of years ago now. And you can see here that they have dug this fairly large facility here. This is a Nioplast inlet. And so what will happen, as I will show, is that the water, when it gets too high, will flow into this facility. But there will be a ponding depth. And then this is the water out. This little pipe right here is for the underdrain and for the observation well. So here in the next image, you can see that they have put down the filter fabric on the sides to separate the soil from the planting media. And they are now putting down the stone, or this is the clean washed 57 stone in the bottom. So the clean wash 57 stone is down now, and they are actually on the right-hand side putting the choker layer down. You can see that it's a slightly smaller stone. And then next to that, you can see that they're starting to put the planting media and the filter media into the bioretention facility. This is one of the end products. And if you were in person, I would ask a number of questions about this facility and about creating success. From an engineering standpoint, I think that this is successful. However, one thing that I will bring up later on is that there are some things that we could have done better on it. And this is really about integrating this facility into the overall site. And this was just shortly after it was planted, so you can see that the planting vegetation is relatively sparse. So this is what I was talking about with creating true success. True success is not only creating an engineering situation solution, but creating something that is integral to the site and that is beautiful. This, you can see, is failure. I did not design this facility. However, it happens to be on one of the routes that I often travel, and I happen to see it. And this is probably at least 3 days after the last big storm event. And you can see that we still have ponding water. Well, what happened? Was it the design of the facility? Was it the construction of the facility? I actually don't know. But I do know that we have failed. And ultimately, with this ponding water here and the water not able to get out of the facility, some of the plants that they had intended to thrive cannot withstand this much inundation for this longer period of time. In addition to that, this facility is probably already gone anaerobic, which means that the microbes that are in that soil are starting to do what the microbes do, and they're changing the filter media, likely clogging it at this point. Also, I wanted to show you or point out to you this fence right here, that the designer thought, hey, let's put a barrier out so that people don't fall into this facility. However, as you can see, there's not enough room. And so the cars are actually nudging this fence over. So this is something where we're looking at it and this facility doesn't truly fit into the site. Here's another failure that happens to be on one of my also treks, and also not one that I designed. This is in a parking lot. And ironically, this facility is doing some of the things that it really was intended to do. And some of it, I think, is just by happen chance. So you can see all of the trash that it's collecting. That trash would have otherwise ended up ultimately into the Chesapeake Bay. And so this is great that it is collecting this trash. The water here, once again, is ponding, and I've seen it pond for at least a week afterwards. So at this point, we might have frogs in here. We're definitely breeding mosquitoes, which is potentially a big issue, especially now. And I think that the designer in this situation was just lucky because they happened to plant a sedge that really loves having wet feet. And it can withstand the inundation for longer periods of time and still thrive. Now, if there were other plants in here, this is a monoculture, and those have now passed away or died. So as I mentioned, infiltration is incredibly important. And so if you're designing a rain garden or bioretention for something that's going to be regulated, it is incredibly important to get the geotechnical information that discusses infiltration. And that really tells us whether or not we need an underdrain and whether or not this water is going to filter through the system. Here you can see the geotech is actually at a school. They're doing some borings for a potential bioretention that we are going to design. And here you can see the chart and how deep that they went, and then the infiltration testing. And typically in our area, the infiltration rate that they require is at least a 0.8. Some jurisdictions require more, like 1.2 inches per hour. But typically in my neck of the woods, it is 0.8. And if it's lower than that, then we really need to look at an underdrain. And like I said, some places, even if you have good infiltration, they still require an underdrain. In addition to this, most agencies want to verify the depth of the groundwater. And I was recently working on a trail project where we had pretty good infiltration rates. However, the water table was up relatively high. And so many agencies require a separation between the bottom of the facility that you're designing and the media and the stone layer at the very bottom of 2 feet or some separation. And some will allow, as long as you have an underdrain in the system, to go ahead and put an impermeable liner in, such as an EPDM liner. Here's a little bit more information about infiltration. Here they're using a hand auger just to be able to get out to the site a little bit easier. And we often do this on other projects. And this is the actual graphic that they send to us typically, showing where they hit what. So for example, at 4 feet, they hit a brown, wet, medium silt. So what do you do if you're doing a rain garden for a client and it's a residence and you don't have to worry about working through code, or the code will actually allow you to do the infiltration yourself. And so this is a chart that is put out by Montgomery County Rainscapes Reward that actually tells homeowners what they need to do in which to test the infiltration at their house. And so the very first thing that you do is you call Miss Utility, at least in my neck of the woods, to make sure that you're not hitting any power lines or any telecom lines or anything like that. Then you're going to dig a hole, and typically the hole is a 1 foot diameter hole. Some people choose to dig a deeper one, and you go 2 feet deep. We have found that a post hole digger works really well depending on your soils, but as we move into rockier soils, you're definitely going to need a digging bar. After you get the test pit to the depth of 1 foot by 2 feet deep, you fill it full with water. And then typically you cover it up to make sure that your small child or dog or your mother-in-law doesn't step in the hole. And then you come back after 24 hours and then you fill it up again. And then after that, you monitor it to see how quickly the water is draining. And if it drains over a short period of time, such as in 24 to 36 hours, then your percolation rate is sufficient to be able to move forward. So why do we not want ponding water? And ultimately, this is the issue right here. So mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are a big problem right now, and especially as you move further south. I know with climate change, there's lots of discussion about how diseases that once we didn't have to worry about as we move further north in the United States are actually becoming an issue. And so this is something that we definitely don't want to be dealing with. And it can be an issue, as I'll explain. So this was a project that I did, and this was pro bono done project with a bunch of other landscape architects. And it was done at a school. And it was a really interesting process because where you see this bridge right here, on either side, we have actually a rain garden that was supposed to be a drier rain garden and then a wetter rain garden. And we designed it as such so that it was a teaching opportunity and that we might plant slightly different plants in each of them. Well, this wasn't a situation, well, part of it was a situation of infiltration. The facility that was going to be wetter actually, it didn't perk terribly well, but it did perk some. And so we thought that, well, if the water comes in here, it will perk slower than on the other side. What happened is during construction, the contractor that was installing the irrigation system actually broke one of the irrigation lines. And the water was just seeping under the ground, and we didn't know that it was broken. We just knew there was tons of water in this facility. And so after a week of being wet, we started seeing mosquitoes loving it. After 2 weeks, there were tons of mosquitoes. We even had a frog that decided to start making their home here. And we put mosquito dunks in, so just because it's right next to a school. And ultimately, the situation is that the amount of water coming in and the amount of water that could infiltrate didn't match. And we ended up with ponding water and a problem. However, once the irrigation system was fixed, the problem was fixed. So another tool for success is maintenance. And lots of different agencies have a standard maintenance form to be able to follow. This one gives a series of tasks and how frequently they're supposed to happen and when they're supposed to happen. So it's interesting, but many of these will say after large storm events that you're supposed to go out and visit your facility and make sure that you clean garbage and debris out of them. The issue is that as more and more are being installed, many people are not. And I even have a rain garden in the front of my house, and the plants are so happy in the rain garden, I don't even see the water anymore. Although once upon a time when I could see the water, it was kind of fun to watch it fill up during large storm events. So maintenance is incredibly important for success. So here, this is a bioretention facility that also I did not design, but you can see here that the maintenance regimen for this facility is definitely different than what was initially intended. And there are a couple of problems that might have helped solve this. One issue is the turf grass on the side. Turf grass on these steeper side slopes, which usually they say are 3 to 1, but often end up to being 2 to 1, are really hard to manage and maintain over time. And you can see in the circumstances that the plants either didn't survive in many circumstances or situations here, or the maintenance crew didn't know what was what, and so it got pulled out. And so that's definitely an issue. Another item that's important for success is creating an edge. There's an article that came out in the 2000s by a professor, University of Michigan, Joan Nassar, and she did a lot of research on creating landscapes that are wild and how to make them so that people are more willing to accept them in their landscapes as opposed to a standard panel of turf grass with a couple of trees in it. And one of the things that she talked about is if you create a hard edge, that people are more willing to accept a wilder looking space. And so this edge can be incredibly important in getting people to say, hey, this facility that is in front of my house is beautiful and I like it and I like what it does for the environment, as opposed to creating a pit in the ground that nobody likes. Here's another project I worked on, and you can see here where we designed this strong edge in which the bioretention facility would sit in. And it has so far worked really well. I know that there was concern expressed by some about this being so close to the playground and whether people would fall into the facility. But as far as I know, it has not, and we made sure that the depth was not so deep that it would be detrimental. Here again, where we're seeing side slopes as being part of our failure. So in this circumstance, they did plant the turf grass on the side, and you can see over time that the side slope is just unraveling. And it's definitely an issue to the point where at this time I'm trying to design the side slopes instead of being at 3-to-1, often at 5-to-1, to be able to minimize the side slope unraveling. In addition to that, out of my firm, we are also putting down an erosion control blanket on the side slopes. And then we're cutting holes in it, and the contractor is planting through the side slope to be able to install the facility. This allows the plants that you do intend on the side slope to thrive while the water is running off the surrounding landscape and often hardscape. And so this is a product called Curlex. It's actually an aspen material. They shred up the aspen tree and then put the blanket on it. The fiber, it deteriorates over time. And so within usually about 6 months, you won't see it, to a year. You won't see it anymore. And that gives the plants enough time to root. So now I'm going to talk about maintenance during construction. This is a project that we worked on about 10 years ago. And the bioretention facility actually went in, as you can see here. The planting media went in. The contractor did put up super silt fence around it, which is typically what's required during the construction process by the agency that we're dealing with. However, for whatever reason, it wasn't either managed or maintained correctly, and all of the sediment from the parking lot was able to hop over the super silt fence and basically ruin the facility. So now we have a situation in which the contractor who takes ownership of the site right now has to come in, has to pull out all of the material, and then it has to put new material in. So from the contractor standpoint, this is potentially lost money. and it's unfortunate. However, I even look at it from an ecological standpoint. Here is all this material that we have put in, and now what is the contractor likely going to do with it? Scoop it out and take it to the dump or some type of a landfill, because otherwise it has no more value. And typically nobody will accept the material because now it's all contaminated with the surrounding sediment. So it's something to watch for, and especially in pre-construction meetings, even when you're doing your rain garden, making sure that it's discussed and that everybody's on board. Well, what does happen if we get a huge rainstorm tonight? Here's another facility. I did not design this facility, but you can see here that this facility has been installed for about a year or maybe a year and a half. And for whatever reason, it is just not thriving. You can see that side slopes are rather steep in many circumstances. There is erosion that's happening in the main channel, and that was probably because of the way the contractor put the topsoil down on the side slopes. You can see that all of the plants that were intended for the bottom of the facility have now died, and so definitely an issue. So ways to get past and to find success. For planting, I really like to use more plants and smaller sizes. And we have found that when the plants can fill in the gaps faster, we are more successful for our facility. Many times during the process of planting, the contractor may not do the maintenance. It may not be worth their time. They're just saying, hey, I just have to replace it once, so it's not that big of a deal. And so what I really like to use are 5 or 5.5 inch deep plugs. And you can see here, this was a project that we were planting, and this is some of the plants that the contractor brought out on site. And this plug is a 3-inch plug. Now, the reason that I don't like using quartz and smaller plugs is really because I don't feel that they get down deep enough. The mulch on top is often 3 inches deep, and almost everybody specifies that it'll be 3 inches deep. Well, if you put a plug in and you have 3 inches of mulch, that means that you likely are planting your plug just in mulch, or the mulch is just going to cover everything. And so if you have a 5-inch deep plug, you're able to make sure that that plant is well rooted, even if there is mulch that is put down. So here you can see some of the deeper plugs and an image for them. And these are, I would love to receive these actually when they came out to the site. So this was an exciting project that I worked on, and it was a situation in which we were able to convey to the client not only the planting regime for the entire site, but also the planting for the bioretention. And in this circumstance, we color-coded it and then used the images, and I'm sure many of you have used this technique. However, we also went a step further and broke it up so that you could see what would happen during each season. And I'm not showing all of them, but this is the planting May to June and the color coding of how those colors are going to push up through the rest of the planting. And this technique has worked really well to be able to convey to our clients how the process works. It also helps us as we study the design process to look at color, texture, and seasonality for the planting regime that we design. So planting for these facilities is incredibly important. Here's a couple of examples on one project that we used, and it has been successful as integrating the entire site. I skipped a slide there. Here you can see carex. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about green mulch. And some people have not heard the phrase before. Many people have. So I really enjoy using green mulch. I am finding that it is creating an ecosystem that before it was individual plants with a barren area of mulch around it. And so now we're able to really fill in those gaps with smaller plants that can thrive. So this is one example that I really like using. The image on the right-hand side is actually from my rain garden, and you can see the iris versicolor there in bloom. But what's underneath it is the common blue violet. And I know many people are saying, oh no, this is kind of a thug and we consider it a weed. But kept in check with an appropriate border, this can really fill in the spaces. And I have stopped using, go to the store every year, getting mulch and putting it into my garden. And what this does is it really allows the space to be filled in, especially in a rain garden and especially a bioretention if they aren't being maintained the way that they're supposed to be. Here's another option. This is the heath aster. And this tends to like a little bit drier feet, so it could be an issue right in the bottom, but you could move it up to the sides and let that be part of your planting. Wild geranium. This plant tends to get a little bit taller. However, it will work, and depending on the plants that you're planting over the top of it, it is a good option. Barren strawberry. I love using this plant, and also many people are like, hey, not my favorite as far as having to deal with this, but it really helps to occupy and fill the spaces. Another plant that is a little bit of a thug, and some people also consider it a weed, but it really can work well in a rain garden. And then golden ragwort here as it fills in. This can also get a little bit tall, so depending on how you overplant it, but this can work well. So really, ultimately, we are trying to create rain gardens that are places. These are the places that we live. These are our front yards. These are the fronts of our schools and our businesses. These are our streetscapes. And I show this image, and it tends to almost always happen with a wetland, that this is the vision many people are getting of rain gardens and bioretention facilities. This is the depression that is across the street. It's full of trash. We hate it. When are they going to fill it in and get rid of this nuisance that is part of our landscape? And really, what we want to do is to create a place that people enjoy. This is a bioretention facility for a project that I actually did not design, but it has struggled. And a part of it, the reason that it struggled is it's not truly part of the place. It wasn't designed first as a streetscape. It was designed as an isolated bioretention facility. And the person that lives in behind this facility is kind of just not the happiest person. Here again, this is creating a place where the bioretention is part of the playground experience. Again, creating a place for nature to come back in and for the world to become wild. This is a bioretention and a monarch that is surviving and enjoying. Again, creating a streetscape and a truly that is part of the street experience. This is Brookside Gardens. And Brookside Gardens, a lot of the design was about moving water and how water moves through the site. You can see here the bioretention facility. This is a green wall right here. And this is a seat wall here where people can sit and enjoy the space. This is also Brookside Gardens. This is a parking lot. And you can see the gentle side slope here, the hard edges here, and then the planting along it. The green space is part of the parking lot and not separate from it. The parking lot again. Here again. This is that bioretention facility that didn't have any plants in it before, the green wall, and what it looks like now. So compare that to this and ask yourself, please, was I successful here? And was my team successful? Well, I would say that, once again, from an engineering standpoint, we are picking up water. But I think that from a design integration standpoint, we probably weren't successful. And I can go into the reasons why, but I think that I will leave that to your imagination right now. And with that, here is, well, my contact information got cut off. So maybe I will slide this down so that you can see it. And I was supposed to remind everybody that if you happen to have any questions that you would like to ask, please type them in and we will go ahead and answer them. And I will exit out of this and slide this last slide down so you can see my contact information while I answer those questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stephen. So we have many questions. Let's start with could you go back to the two excuse me, to the two anatomy slides, the rain garden and bioretention, and show them again while you're repositioning? And can you talk a little bit about the green wall that you mentioned?
Yes, I would be happy to. So here are these slides. So here's the anatomy of the rain garden right here that you see. And I can talk through them, or if you just wanted to see them for a minute.
Just to see them for a minute and then have you discuss the green wall in more detail.
Okay, great. So the green wall was actually a proprietary product from a Furbish company, is what the name of the company is. And on that project, we were looking at all ways that we could teach the community how to create a greener, more sustainable landscape. And so this green wall was something that we thought would back up well against the bioretention facility and also give us the gentler slope going up the hill for the rest of the garden. And so the blocks are actually concrete with a void behind them. And they stack up, and what you do is put the plants into this void where you can actually put topsoil in it. And there is a geo strap that they use to hold the wall in place that is part of that entire process. So this is the anatomy of the rain garden here. And then I will go to the anatomy of the bioretention bioswale with my preference for the green mulch over it. One thing that I will mention about this is that most entities will require the mulch when this goes down initially. And so what I do is we actually put the plants, all of the plants down, including the green mulch plants, and we still put the mulch down, the 3-inch mulch. that will allow this to hop through the permitting requirements.
Okay. You mentioned several green mulch plant options. What's your favorite green mulch combination?
Oh, that's a really good question. So, to be honest, as I mentioned before, the strawberry and the violet have worked really, really well for me in many circumstances. And I think that the two of them tend to stay relatively low and they fill in really quick and they are durable. The violet brings an additional benefit because similar to legumes, it's actually a nitrogen fixer. And so it does add that to the entire process for bringing nitrogen into the soils.
Okay. And do you find any problem with rabbits going after some of these plants that you've recommended?
So I've had problems. I've had not so much problems with rabbits, but voles I have had problems with. And I have seen voles really enjoy these landscapes. One thing that's interesting that the voles really, really love, and it wasn't anything that I put on here, but it is turtle head. And I really like putting turtle head hot lips into the garden because it adds this splash of hot pink at a specific time during the growing season when nothing else is really happening. But the voles love that root. And I have had entire areas of hot lips disappear. So I will say that it's smart and wise to plant some diversity in these facilities. However, some designers love to put, hey, this is my favorite 20 plants, and I'm going to put one in each in the facility. And if your facility is huge, you can probably get away with it. But I would tend to stay and simplify it and keep it anywhere from 6 to 8 plants, depending on the size of the facility, especially if you're not maintaining it or know who's going to maintain it, because many people may say, oh, that's a weed, I better pull it up.
Okay, very good. What can you recommend for a filtration barrier above a stone swale?
So the we call that typically a forebay in the design process, and in the forebay, and our Penny, do you know if that's related to plants or not related to plants?
It says that the site is about a 100-foot driveway adjacent to a forest, so there is forest debris.
Oh, interesting. So you're getting this, and I'm hoping, or maybe that the channel is planted, but maybe it's not. So the forebay area is what we often do is create a break between either the swale or the bioretention or the rain garden so that there's a smaller ponding area that then has a dam of some kind. And I don't have an image in any of these. Well, maybe I did. A check dam in, you can see it here. This is a check dam here, but you can make these out of stone. Usually there's a little notch in it so that the water can get through it. You can make them out of timbers. You can make them out of a number of different materials. I've used steel on some, weathering steel on others. But this can help to create a situation in which traps that larger debris before it starts to go down the swale.
Okay. Do you amend the soil, and if so, with what?
Oh, that's a great question. So for a rain garden, I do amend the soil. And what I will do is, so my preference is to test it and to get a sample of the amended of the soil, the in situ soil or the soil on site, and actually send it in and get it tested. And then after it is tested, actually use that test to then amend the soil. Now, if I don't want to do it, which is totally fine. I know that there's circumstances when we don't test the soil and we're just like, hey, this is my gut feeling, or this is not a big issue. Then I will go ahead and amend it with a couple of inches of compost, and amend it with either a little bit, so an inch of perlite, or a couple of inches of sand, and then I will till all of that material in. But it is still better to get it tested and then follow the testing.
Okay, great. We have a couple of questions about the planting process. One is, do you plant in succession to allow the plants to grow and fill in? And as an associated question, when you space your plants, do you how tightly do you space them for maturity?
Yes, those are great questions. So I have not planted anything in succession with the exception of my own rain garden at my own house. And mostly that's a situation of me trying out different things and seeing what works where. And typically on a commercial site, I don't have that kind of leeway. Usually it's like, hey, the construction's happening, we're putting everything together on site, and the plants are going in, and then we're going to walk away, and then they'll be maintained. So typically not. As far as the spacing, so I follow the plant sizing. However, for example, if I'm planting plugs, so those 5-inch deep plugs, and the plant says that it's going to be spread to 18 inches, I am going to plant it so that it's more like 12 inches on center instead of the 18 inches on center. And some cases I may even draw that back to 9 inches on center depending on the type of plant, and if I know it's going to be a thug in the landscape, or if it's one of the plants a little daintier and it needs a little bit more help. So if it's a thug, then I'll leave that spacing at 12. If it's a plant that, hey, needs a little help to get to its maturity, then I'll plant it even at 9 inches on center, so half of what it's going to actually spread to.
Okay, very good. And in terms of planting, do you ever plant trees or shrubs? If so, what type? And do you plant them as bare root, or what sizing do you use?
That's a great question. So let's start with the trees. Trees, I love planting in these facilities. And I really think that it's important, especially when you're creating a space and a place. So I'm going to go back to this example. So there are a series of bioretention and rain gardens that are here, and you can see that this island right here is actually not a rain garden, but right here it is. And so we've planted trees all through this. And the trees can really vary, and trees will often be able to handle the slightly wetter feet. Now, oaks, no. Sycamore, yes. Red maple, yes. So there are definitely a series of trees that I have been able to plant. But if it's an oak, for example, I'll bring it up further on the hillside. If it's a dogwood, I will typically drag it up. So when you are in a valley bottom, a stream valley bottom, and you think of the trees that will thrive and survive in that situation, then those are the types of trees that I typically select. So river birch, I think it works really well in the facility, and now you can get them so that you can get them in multi-stem and you can get them in single stem. Typically, I'm planting B&B. And although you can plant bare root because of cost issues, and it's an installation process, and most of the contractors that I'm dealing with are more comfortable with dealing with the B&B as opposed to bare root. So shrubs, yes, we also definitely plant shrubs. I will say that it does depend on the client and the situation. I have found that when shrubs are planted, that they need to be also planted a little closer to each other. I prefer to plant smaller shrubs, such as 1 gallon or 2 gallon instead of 5 gallon plants. And there are many to choose from. Ilex works really well because it is evergreen and it allows that shrub to be able to fill in the space. But there are many other lists that you can choose from.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about the soil mixes that you have had success with? One of the questions is looking for guidance on the highly sandy soil mixes and wanting to know if they create conditions that are too mesic and are either really dry or really wet.
Yeah, the high sand soil content, that's a great question. And there's a great debate in the field about using these higher sand based soils. So I've used both. I've used the option of the third compost, the third topsoil, and the third sand. And in almost all circumstances, I have found success with that mix. And that is the mix that you're seeing with this garden that you see in front of you. And part of that is because the permitting agency that was permitting this project specifically, they require that mix and they don't allow you to deviate from it. When we were designing the guidelines for the district transportation department for their right-of-ways, we went with a much higher sand content for those facilities. We had a soil scientist that we brought on as part of our design team, and we worked really closely with him. One of the things that we found with that is the choker layer becomes incredibly important. And what happens is if the choker layer is designed appropriately, the water, as it infiltrates into that sand-based soil, will actually be held until it reaches full capacity. And then once it reaches full capacity for how much water it can take on, then it will start to drip it out the bottom. But you have to design the choker layer in such a way so that the pressure in below it is actually lower. And it becomes a little bit complicated. And it's one of the reasons that I don't like using them, because it almost becomes a situation where you want to bring a soil scientist onto your team to create a situation where you're creating a successful planting media for the plants to thrive and that it doesn't dry out during dry periods. So it's not so much being too wet, it's too dry. And so that's my advice, that if you're going to go with more sand-based, that you look at bringing on a soil scientist, or your specs and design details are in place that are really stringent to make sure that you have success.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Okay. We have a couple of questions about maintenance. One is a situation at an apartment building where the mowing contractor is scalping the grass in the bioretention facilities. And the question is there anything that can be done since the property owner doesn't want to go with more expensive contractors? And the other question is, in general, are maintenance professionals part of your design and recommendations?
So we do so let me start with the last question first. We do put specifications into our design drawings for the maintenance requirements for a project. And unfortunately, for many of my projects, after they're built, I walk away and it's left up to the client to be able to deal with the actual maintenance. And then I come back and I'm like, oh, that didn't work out so well because they're not maintaining it the way it should be maintained. One of the tools that is best to get past that hump, and if you have a close enough relationship with the client, is to actually either leave behind booklet that tells the contractor very clearly how they're supposed to maintain it after you leave, so that the client can actually just take the booklet, hand it to their maintenance contractor, and then say, this is what it is. And often in that booklet, I will include pictures of the plants that are supposed to be in the facility so that they can then share it with their junior staff and they know what they're supposed to weed out or leave into place. So that's one of the recommendations I would make as far as maintenance is concerned. Now for the apartment complex and what's going on there, that gets a little bit complicated. I think that one thing that you could do is offer up to the client to see if they would pay you to be able to sit down with the maintenance contractor and say, hey, can we have an education scenario, and sit down with them and work through that. So maybe a 1 or 2 hour workshop so that they know what they're dealing with. The other option is, once again, the edge. Having the apartment complex install some type of an edge, whether it's a timber edge, whether it's a concrete edge, whether I've used Trex or composite timbers and turned them on their side so that you can bend them, and giving the contractor that edge so that they know where the facility starts and stops, and then installing signs is also very helpful. And those signs can be part of educating not only the contractor, but also educating the people in the apartment complex as to why this is important.
Okay, very good. A few more questions about green mulch. One, will green mulch interfere with tree growth if planted all around the trees?
So that's a great question, and I have not seen that happen. I know that when we deal with turf grass, for example, that sometimes there can be a situation where the turf grass and the tree are actually fighting against each other for nutrients and water. And depending on the tree often wins out, but not always. But I have not seen a situation with a tree where that has happened. However, I will say one thing. On this project, this is Brookside Gardens is actually a public garden, and they have a series of gardeners that help manage and maintain the facility. And the lead gardener did say that the planting media for the trees was a little too thin as far as the nutrients for the trees to thrive as much as he wanted. However, the herbaceous material was doing gangbusters. So it's a little bit of a dance as far as putting trees into facilities similar to this.
All right. Do you have any recommendations for green mulch to work in the shade?
So yes, Actually, the violet works beautiful in the shade and will really take the shade. Ginger will also does quite well in the shade. There are a number of sedges and carex and that you can look at, but many of them will work well in the shade, as well as some of the low-growing. It'll come to me. My mind just went completely blank. I will, by the end of this, I'll probably remember what I'm trying to say, but right now my mind went completely blank, so we'll
Okay.
keep going.
We are running out of time and have time for just one last question. What is the brand of biodegradable mesh that was used on the slope?
It's called Curlex, and it starts with a C, C-U-L. I believe it's C-U-L-E-X is what I believe it is.
Thanks again, Stephen. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you all. Have a great day.